Always Be Connecting is a call to action in business across 5 key audiences: prospects, clients, team, industry, and community. Strong ties across these areas provide happiness, security, support, and a sense of purpose. I'm Lindsay Houston, and I run Storytellers Australia, content marketing and design business in Sydney. Each week, I will be meeting valuable people in business who will share their ideas of how to have healthier work lives and grow a network of supporters. A few months ago, I did a course called Leading with Emotional Intelligence. And although not an obvious skill needed for a content maker, I walked away now knowing that I've got a few skills to brush up on. That course was delivered by our next guest, and I was inspired by his delivery in that he was patient and personable. He regularly partners with leaders from top consulting firms and has passed on his knowledge to thousands of CEOs, managers, and leaders. The lovely Jeremy Mark Davis joins us from Melbourne.
I was going to say, it's good to be with you, the lovely Lindsay. So,
Jeremy, how are you?
I'm good. It's good to be with you.
You're very good. So let's start big picture. What's the concept of emotional intelligence?
Look, emotional intelligence is one of those things where you could define it in lots of different ways. If I think about what emotional intelligence is, I think about it as being aware of and able to harness emotions both in ourselves and other people in a way that gets positive outcomes. So if you are in a conflict situation and you take a deep breath before you respond, so you say something that you think is an appropriate thing to say, then I would say that is an emotional intelligent action. And it doesn't matter if you haven't read on any books on emotional intelligence, or you've never done a program like the one that you and I did together, or you've never even heard of emotional intelligence before. If you're the kind of person who, if a colleague or a partner says something that you find a bit challenging and you just know, okay, well, rather than go with my initial response and say something I might regret, I'm just going to take a deep breath here before I respond, then I would say that is an emotional intelligence action. So yeah, that's I think the easiest way to define it.
And the way I like to start the podcast, Jeremy, is I tend to look for who the person I'm talking to was at school to just sort of place who I'm talking to. So who were you at school? Where did you fit in?
I reckon I was a pretty geeky kind of a student at school. So I was kind of fairly, tall, skinny, fairly daggy. Some would say I probably haven't changed that much in school. I was into my sport, so I used to do a lot of running and playing badminton. And yeah, I probably for a lot of the time, just like a lot of teenage boys, just kind of a mopey and fairly uncommunicative teenage boy for a fair portion of it would have been a good summary of me, I think.
And what led you to working in this field?
Probably a misguided notion originally. So I studied psychology as one of my majors at university, and I was kind of just interested in what makes people tick and being able to help people. When I initially had a misguided idea that recruitment would be a really great way to help people kind of find their career mission and align them with their career mission. So I got into recruitment, and I learned a lot of great things in recruitment and don't regret going into it. But one of the things I discovered pretty quickly was it wasn't really so much about the candidate finding their life purpose and achieving their career goals as much as it was the employer, who often had hundreds of applicants for the same position, and it was just a process of obviously whittling down to the successful candidate. So I did that for a while. I went well at it, but I didn't want to do it for the long term. And then I thought, okay, kind of training and facilitation is the space I would like to get into. So I spent 2.5 years working for a corporate training company and did pretty well. And I think I woke up one morning and said to my then girlfriend, now wife, I said, I think I'm okay at this caper, and I think you don't need a lot of, it's not like other industries where you need a lot of capital, I suppose, to set up and begin. So I said, I think I'm just going to start working for myself. So I quit my job, and that was about 20 years ago.
So, but in being in recruitment, it must give you a really wide view of relationships at work. Like,
I
would you
think
have conflict resolution to deal with, or is it more pairing people who would work well together in that sort of psychology way?
yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that working recruitment particularly provided any particular relationships based insights more so than working anywhere else. I think that probably the main thing I took from it was I just had the opportunity to work with a leader that I found to be a great leader who I also regard as being very emotionally intelligent. So I
Mm.
think the main kind of thing that I took from that experience, if you like, was some ideas about the power of leadership, and being somebody that I regarded as being a very emotionally intelligent person and able to kind of work directly with this person who was like a father figure and like a mentor with me. So that would be the
Yeah.
big takeout for me, I think, from the recruitment days.
So, um, what? Let's talk about emotional intelligence red flags.
Uh-huh.
Uh, what 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 can people identify in their lives as a deficit of emotional intelligence if they don't know the term very well, you know?
Yeah, I mean, there's many different ways you could think about that question. One really famous example is a guy by the name of John Gottman did some research that's become very famous a number of years ago now. And essentially, what they did is they got people in almost like in a studio setup, not dissimilar to the one that we're in now, although they were there in person, but they were being recorded and all the audio was being captured as well. And essentially, what they did was get people to come in and spend some time talking about an issue that was like, a low level conflict issue in their relationship. So it might be, Lindsay, you might say, look, I think we should get a cat. And your partner might feel like they're not really a cat person. So they're not violently opposed to the idea of getting a cat, but you kind of feel like it would be a good idea to get a cat and they are less keen on it. Or maybe you think that there's a particular location you should go to on a holiday in 2024, and the partner's got a different view about, no, we should go to this location. So they got people in relationships in, they got them having a discussion about a low level conflict item, and they recorded people doing this. And basically what they did was then from a research level, they had coders observe these interactions between people and look for certain, your question was what are some red flags in a relationship? So they were looking for some specific red flags in relationships, and then we'll come back to what those 4 red flags were in a minute. But
Yep.
where it gets really interesting is they then went back many years later. I think it was 10 years later, and based on the recordings that they'd observed of these low-level conflict interactions, they made predictions, and they said, look, when we come back in the future, which of these couples is still going to be in a relationship and which of the couples is going to be divorced, right? These were married couples. And they were able to predict with amazingly 95% accuracy which of the couples would still be together and which of the couples would be divorced, right? So
Yeah.
if ever you want an amazing study that was great at looking for red flags, this was a pretty good example of it. And so the question is, okay, well, what were the 4 red flags that people were looking for? And the answer is, and they use the terminology, actually, the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, like a biblical reference to say, if you've got these horsemen riding around in your relationship, then you're heading for an apocalypse or a divorce, right? So the first one was criticism. So if you made a suggestion about, you said, I think we should go to location X for the holiday, and I started making some comments that were quite critical about that idea or about the way you said it, that would be one red flag that you'd be looking for. Another one was around defensiveness. So if there was a sense that we're in a low-level conflict situation and the observers could see that people were acting in quite a defensive manner, that would be another red flag. Another one was around stonewalling. So if there was this discussion around whether or not we were going to get the cat or not, and it felt like one or more of the parties started to kind of stonewall on their position and really dig in, that would be another red flag. And the final one, and in fact, the one that was the single most powerful indicator of whether or not people would be in a relationship or still married down the track, was contempt. So the minute that there's any indication of contempt in a relationship, then that's the biggest of all the red flags. And typically, in my experience, when somebody demonstrates some kind of contempt towards another person, it's generally at a fairly subtle level. So it's unusual to see in a relationship where somebody would say, look, you know, I think all of your ideas are complete rubbish and I don't really want to listen to what you've got to say anymore. That would be very high level contempt. In my experience, it's very unusual to see that. What you see is more low level indicators of contempt, where maybe somebody's talking over the top of the other person or not really listening to what they're saying. And when contempt exists, that is the biggest red flag.
And contempt sounds like something that can grow out of the other three as well. So like criticism can lead to contempt, and stonewalling can lead to contempt. And it's something that can grow over time.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. It's not hard to imagine that if you're in a relationship that's characterized by initially things like, you know, defensiveness and stonewalling, that it's not hard to imagine that if that pattern in the relationship is not interrupted, that could then start to escalate into contempt. So I think that's a good pickup.
There's definitely a point where are these things unavoidable? Is there just some mixes of people that go down that route and that it's unsalvageable, or is there a point where you can use emotional intelligence to bring it back to square one, or is it something both parties need to face together?
I mean, the answer is all of the above. So it is avoidable. Is the good news story kind of part of it? It is a function of emotional intelligence, and emotional intelligence is something that a person can change and develop over time, and it is a function of what both the parties or all the parties bring into the relationship. So to the extent that all of the parties involved in the relationship are bringing more emotional intelligence into the space, and that's going to generally create better outcomes for the relationship. Yeah, so all of the above.
What can people do to rein that in, to avoid?
So I think that, to avoid contempt, I think that, you know, there's many things that people could do. One would be having an awareness of the power of any semblance of contempt in a relationship. So if somebody is aware that of all the things that were measured in this experiment, this was the single biggest predictor of, in this case, divorce, but we can use the kind of apocalyptic outcome of a relationship as the same type of scenario, even where people aren't married together, then one of the things that people could do with that is really be very mindful of the fact that if that starts to develop, that needs to be called out really early. So, for example, if somebody was in a discussion with, let's take it now out of a married relationship and say in a business relationship, some of the people I work with say things like, look, I feel that sometimes people treat my ideas with a certain level of contempt based on my age, based on my gender, based on my, you know, racial profile, whatever it might be, right? And so if a person started to sense that that was occurring, it might be about having a tough conversation around that, where they might say with the team member or colleague, hey, I feel like you're not really listening to what I'm saying here, and you're not giving me a chance to fully express my ideas. I'm okay with it if you listen to my ideas and you've got a different point of view, but I'm not okay with being in a situation where I feel like I'm not even being listened to and I'm not even being heard. So just listen
Yeah.
to what I'm saying, to take it on board, so that at least we've got to that part of the conversation, and then let's have a discussion about what do we agree on and what are the points we need to work on. So it's not about those words or phrases, but one thing you could do would certainly be being aware of the damage that contempt can cause, and kind of jumping on that very early.
So how do you, because you mentioned um being aware of your language, and
Mm.
sometimes I use Chat GPT, especially if I'm feeling a bit riled up. I put an email into Chat GPT. I'll say, hey, Chat GPT, can you please take all the emotion out of this?
Right.
So maybe the prompt can go one higher, and like, can you take the contempt, the green contempt out of this conversation? So like, how do you uh monitor your own input to the situation?
Yeah, well, I mean, if we take email as the example that you just gave, was a great one there, then one way you could do it would be along the lines you've just shared. I had a similar thing with Canva recently, where I was doing something in Canva, and it's got the kind of magic wand AI function in Canva, and it says, do you want a more fun way of expressing this, or a more formal way of expressing this? Personally, for me, in that particular experience, I kind of felt like AI has probably got a little bit of a way to go, because none of the suggestions that it made I particularly thought
Yeah.
were great. But let's say in the context of an email, one way you could do it would obviously be getting something like an AI to do it. Another one, and again, a classic one that you hear people say, is before you hit that send button, just let that email sit and
Yeah.
maybe come back to it the next day and read over it with a fresh set of eyes. Maybe get a colleague or a trusted advisor to have a bit of a read over it and say, look, what do you feel about this
That's a good
email?
idea.
What are the bits that are good, or what could be done differently? Put yourselves in the shoes of the other person there. You've got to be mindful when it comes to email, of course, that we don't get all the tone and all the body language going on like we're getting in our communication now. You can't say to an email, oh, can you clarify that? Or I don't understand what you mean, very easily. So, yeah, take a minute to reflect on the email, whether that be just giving yourself a bit more time, or some kind of third party input, or putting yourselves in the other party's shoes. All of those things would probably
Yeah.
help with the email before we hit send.
Is there, so if you do have to establish some boundaries, maybe someone isn't listening, maybe email's not the best method to address those?
No, they say, look, generally speaking, with a conflict situation, that the ideal is actually in person, face to face. Then, so that would be ideal. Now, the reality is that sometimes that's just not a practical solution. So,
Mm.
I'm in Melbourne, you're in Sydney. Ideally, maybe we would like to sit down and have a cup of coffee to have this chat, but it's just not really a viable thing for us to do that. So we're doing it virtually. Well, but we're doing it virtually with all the visuals and all the sound part of it. So that would be another way of doing it. And then if we go down the food chain from kind of in person, virtually face to face, then if you couldn't do either of those two things, the next one would be over the phone. But again, obviously, we're losing the visual there. And most people, if you say, what not to do in terms of dealing with a conflict situation, they would generally say, sending an email is generally at the bottom rung there of where you would go.
So you've got the four horses of the apocalypse.
Yeah.
Is there an opposite of that? Is there four horses of harmony and joy?
Yeah, well, let's take them. So if you think about, stonewalling, it would be looking for solutions, right? So rather than trying to get stuck on your position, you might use words like when they talk about negotiation, they talk about things like, what's an outcome that we can both live with. So rather than us both getting bunkered in on our position and stonewalling, okay, well, probably neither of us is going to get the perfect holiday location we want to go to, but what's a location that we could both live with that's maybe got some of the best bits of the place that you were thinking of going to, Lindsay, with some of the best places that I was thinking about going with. If you think about the opposite
in a business setting, then that's probably, sorry to interrupt, in a business setting, that's probably, what process is something we can both live with. If people have different ways of working or
absolutely
communicating.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, options is often a key word that I think about when you're having a discussion, trying to reach an agreement is, is going to the word options. Okay, well, what are some of the options here? You've said that you want to do the project in this way. I've said I want to do the project in this way. Well, let's get all the different options down on the table first and foremost, and then let's come back and look at those different options and say, what are some of the pros and cons of each one? And then maybe we can agree a way forward after do that. But to start with, let's keep the pen moving. Let's get the mind map out, and let's just say, what are all the different options or all the different ways that we could do this?
But that does still require taking a moment. I think you mentioned that earlier, taking a pause to say the thing that we're doing now isn't working. We need to have this conversation, and that takes half an hour, an afternoon.
It could take a variable period of time. In some instances, the conversation could be as simple as, you even use some words and phrases there that you could imagine somebody using in a business meeting, right? You're there trying to reach an agreement on a particular project that needs to be rolled out by the end of the first quarter in the 2024 calendar year. And you use the words, this is not working. So in some versions of that, the conversation to get into the options mode, that might be less than 60 seconds, where you might say to one of your colleagues, look, I feel like what we're doing here is not working. We're talking about doing it in a particular way, and it just doesn't feel like we're getting to something that we both feel is a viable option for what we're going to do in that first quarter. Let's just now say, what are all the options for all the things that we could do? And then let's come back and say, well, which of these things are viable and which are not. So in that instance, you might be into the options mode in less than a minute. But if there is other factors getting in play, where if you said that to me and there was the defensiveness part of it coming to it, then sometimes that can be about timing. So if I say, well, but Lindsay, I feel like you're criticizing my idea, and this was a great idea for what we should do by the end of the first quarter, and I just feel like you're not giving it the credit that it deserves as a great idea, well, then we might need more time. You might say, look, it feels like we're hitting a bit of a block here, and a classic strategy or a kind of top tip, if you want to call it that, in terms of building healthy relationships is being aware of timing and knowing when to take a time out. So we might just agree, look, right now it feels like we're not really being able to progress this in a way that we're both feeling like is moving forward. Let's just take a time out on this. Let's sleep on it and let's revisit it tomorrow, or let's come back and make this one of our first things we meet about in the new year, when we both had an opportunity just to take a bit of a break over Christmas and reflect on it. And the same thing I think applies in personal relationships. A lot of where personal relationships come undone is people get into these escalating spirals of conflict where the level keeps going up and up and up.
Yeah, and it definitely goes in cycles. Yeah, I've seen that.
Absolutely. So if one of the parties can just say, again, it just feels like we're banging our heads against a brick wall here. Let's sleep on it. Let's grab a cup of coffee tomorrow morning when we're both just rested and back in a better headspace. And then what I often see myself is something I've been in an argument with somebody about for a relatively long period of time. You wake up the next morning and I say, look, I probably shouldn't have said that. And they say, look, I didn't really mean what I said around that. And literally the thing that you were arguing about for 10 or 15 minutes the day before, it's literally over in, again, less than a minute. And now we're on to, you know, the next thing.
So if stonewalling the horse of the goodness is options, what about let's go to criticism?
Yeah.
Um,
So let's think about what these are good questions. I've never thought about them in their inverse before. So let's just play around with this together. So I think if the opposite, well, an example of an opposite of criticism could be, you know, one of the activities that we used to do, you know, I'm going back about 20 years ago now, back in the training days, when we did workshops around innovation and creativity, we did an
yeah,
activity around, it was called the pink wheelbarrow activity, right? So it was like, imagine that you're working in a marketing agency or some kind of creative agency,
yeah,
and one of your colleagues has lobbed up and said to you, I've got this great idea for a new product that we need to launch into the market. It's a pink wheelbarrow, right?
okay, I'm down.
What are our immediate responses to this suggestion of a pink wheelbarrow? And
Yeah,
typically, what people did was give a lot of quite negative responses to that, right? So they would
yeah,
say things like, "That seems really impractical. It doesn't really seem like it would be on trend in the market," and all these types of things. And then we would say, "Okay, so let's just capture those ideas that we've come up with and say which of these are kind of constructive criticism and which of these are negative criticism." And of course, it was generally very heavily stacked towards negative criticism. And then we'd
mm,
say, okay, so let's now talk about, if we wanted to begin with some constructive ideas or suggestions about this idea, what might they look like? And of course, people would
yeah,
say things, well, this would be a completely unique product in the market. Like there's hundreds of wheelbarrows out there, but there are no pink ones. Maybe it would appeal more to certain demographics, like female, who are not targeted by any of the existing
yeah,
wheelbarrows in the marketplace. Maybe you've got females who love to do gardening. Maybe they would, and so it goes. So the point of it was to say, and the big takeout or the aha moment was to say, okay, well, think about what's it going to be like in your work relationships if the minute that one of your colleagues presents a new idea or suggestion, where we immediately go to is into the negative criticism and then all the reasons why it won't work. What effect is that going to have
yeah,
on creativity and innovation in your team and your organization? So,
yeah.
and the opposite of criticism could be the pink wheelbarrow. So, okay, that's an interesting idea you put forward. Let's talk about what are some of the things that are great about this idea or some of the suggestions. Now, people say, oh, well, but hold on, isn't that being naive? Aren't there all these fatal flaws, all the idea or suggestion that need to be talked about? Otherwise,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
we won't get to that. And of course, the answer is that as human beings, we're going to get to that. We don't need to worry about that too much, right? We're pretty good at picking holes in things. We're pretty good at giving people
Yeah.
reasons why things won't work or the weaknesses. But if one of the things we start to do in relationships is just when we are presented with a new idea or suggestion, give it a bit of an opportunity to breathe and think about what could be some of the cool things about this idea. That would be an example of an opposite of criticism.
Well, funnily enough, something my partner has brought into business and into our personal lives is from improvisation, where everything is yes and.
Right,
There's,
exactly.
there's no bad ideas. There's just ideas that aren't good yet. And that
Right.
takes a group of people ideating and working together with all their individual perspectives. So maybe someone starts off with a pink wheelbarrow and then someone brings in, well, let's make it smell of roses or
Absolutely, and even again, the language that you used there was a great insight, right? Because you know, a classic thing that we do when we're trying to encourage ideation and innovation in teams is we start off by doing that at some kind of process whereby we encourage different ideas and suggestions, and then what we do is we say, okay, so look, all of these are really interesting ideas about the way this could work, but we now need to talk about this or that. And that, so we've used the word there, but. So
Yeah,
but
yeah.
is a negative conjunctive, right? So if it's A but B, the effect of a word like but is it cancels out the A. It's like, Lindsay, I really like you as a friend, but it's like, right, that's not going to go really well. But if I
Yeah,
said, Lindsay, I really like you as a friend, and one of the things I'd love to talk more
beautiful.
about is how we deal with conflict when it's going to come up from time to time,
Yeah, yeah,
when
yeah.
we see things differently. That's a whole different conversation. So these are examples of, really simple, practical things that people can do that do have a very positive effect on their relationships, whether that's be in a work point of view
Mm.
or from a non-work point of view.
Um, Funny about your butt, uh,
As it were.
as it were. Um, my partner Tom, he knows a lot about these sorts of things with ideation. Walt Disney used to have a no jar in the middle of idea sessions, and anyone said no, money in the jar, everyone goes buy pizza at the end. So
Yes.
maybe we can extend that to a few other negative words, the buts and
I mean, you can do it.
justice,
You
maybe.
can extend it to the negative. So, we always say, however is but in a tutu, right? So, however is another example of a negative conjunctive. Or to take your point before about what does that look like in a positive sense, I've heard it used of kind of the more times you can say yes in a relationship, that's one of the best predictors of relationship success, right? So, again,
Yeah, okay.
uh, somebody makes an idea or suggestion, and that may, why don't we go for a walk this afternoon, or why don't we do this? And you kind of wasn't on the top of your to-do list to go for a
Yeah.
walk right now, but you think, okay, yeah, let's just go for a walk and let's spend a bit of time together. Or your team member says, why don't we spend a bit of time thinking about what it would look like if we collaborated with this other marketing agency, and you're a bit 50-50 on the whole collaboration piece, but you say, yeah, right, why don't we just explore for a few minutes what it could look like
Yeah.
to do some kind of
Worst
collaboration?
can happen.
Yeah, exactly. And if you get 5 minutes down the track and there are some reasons why that idea won't fly, that's okay. But so, yeah, saying a lot of yes in a relationship is the positive version of your Walt Disney story.
And there's also a Guy Ferrari, who's a chef in
Uh-huh.
America. He's got two rules he lives by, which is try something new, don't be a grump,
Yeah,
which
right.
I think
Yeah.
is pretty in there. So we've got stonewalling, criticism, the second
Yeah.
one of the four apocalypse.
We got defensiveness and contempt for the other two ones there.
So let's go defensiveness.
Yeah, so I think we're kind of jumbling them around a little bit here, but we talked about, defensiveness could be the opposite of that, could be something around openness. So, openness and empathy. So if somebody's got a different point of view to you, one way of responding is by getting defensive. Well,
Mm,
that's a really good idea I had. I can't see why you don't see the merit in it. Whereas another one could be around openness and curiosity. Oh, okay, Lindsay. So um, I'm really curious to understand more in terms of why you feel that idea may not work for us in the first quarter of next year. So that sense of kind of openness and curiosity would be
yeah.
a different approach to the rather than defensiveness.
And there's something in somebody's brain when they are being defensive or wanting to bring something to the table that needs to be explored, but they don't have the emotional intelligence maybe to present that. So I guess it's up to everyone else to recognize what's going on, what's actually happening before being defensive to the defensive, or like, oh, okay, they're not happy, but the reason they're not happy is because I've done something that hasn't brought them in. You know,
Yeah, yeah, and I mean, I feel like part of what you were talking about there also relates to Sometimes when people, if you're really getting into an idea or a situation where people are being creative, a lot of people, part of the creative process is about throwing ideas into the space that are not fully formed, and you're just kind of experimenting with them, right? So I think that if you want to encourage that type of a process, then it's really important that we think about the way in which we create an environment where people feel comfortable to do that. Mel Robbins talks about this thing like the 5 second rule, right? Which is like, if you have this idea or this insight in your gut, then within 5 seconds, you need to do something with that. You need to articulate it. You need to make a note to follow up on that. You need to send an email around it, because our rational mind is really good at coming up with all these rational reasons as to why that idea would appear to never be something that could work. But actually, our intuition and our gut sometimes knows things that our rational mind is not even aware of. So if you say, yeah, I've just got that gut feeling like it would be great for me to connect with that person, then if you just jumped onto LinkedIn on your phone and just ping that person a one-line message to say, hey, I was just thinking about you, and I just think it would be great if we could find even 15 minutes to have a phone conversation early in 2024 to talk about some stuff we could work on.
Beautiful.
If you do that really quickly, then that's a way of kind of overcoming this thing where your ideas get stifled. And the same thing applies to encouraging ideas in conversations. If we're mindful that when somebody is coming up with ideas, it's quite embryonic, and if our approach is just to go straight down the path of criticism and all the reasons why it won't work, then you're probably not going to have a relationship or a team where people come up with ideas. But if you just say, oh, that's a really interesting idea, let's just give that a chance to breathe and see where it could go, then that's going to be the kind of relationship or team environment where people feel like, yeah, if I've got an idea or a suggestion, I can just throw that out with Lindsay, and we're going to explore it.
So the Bowser of the four apocalypse horses,
The big daddy.
contempt.
Contempt.
What's the opposite of contempt? So I guess it's almost love, isn't it?
What would be the opposite of contempt? The opposite of contempt.
I kind of feel it's kind of like a contempt is something that will bring you down. Whereas whatever this word we're trying to think of is sort of like that Madonna song, lift you, or Stevie Wonder, lift you to your higher ground.
Yeah, I think it's to me, words like kind of respect comes into mind. So I think
that's a good one.
I think contempt is definitely a negative energy state, and clearly we want to go into the positive, like you say. If somebody's really contemptuous of somebody, then I think that, to me, that feels like they don't really respect either that person themselves or what they're saying. So if if I really respect you and what you're saying and your ideas, I don't think I can simultaneously respect you and your ideas and hold you and your ideas in contempt. So yeah, I'm not sure if that's a dictionary style kind of antonym of contempt, but I think if we really have deep respect for another person, that might be part of where that would land.
Yeah, it's like Brené Brown suggests there aren't enough words in the English language to explain all emotions and feelings towards each other. So maybe this.
No, that's right. Yeah, and actually, I hear some people, create new words because of that exact reason. So there's a guy who's written a book called Tiny Habits. His name is BJ Fogg, but he basically said there is no word in the English language that describes well what a human being does when they congratulate themselves for doing something well, like making a positive change in a relationship, for example. So he created a word which he says, what you do is you shine. So yeah, it is interesting how some of the things that we want to articulate and do, sometimes there isn't even a word in the English language that really adequately describes what that thing is.
And do you think that sometimes a relationship just is untenable and doomed for the apocalypse? Is there any is there a way to redeem the irredeemable?
I mean, I think, and again, if we just reflect on our own experiences, I think there's definitely times in our lives, and we could probably all think about this from a work and a non-work point of view, where it definitely reaches a point that the best thing for both parties is to go our separate ways, right? So whether that's in the context of a business relationship or a business environment, or in a personal relationship, I think we've all had times where we think, well, yeah, I could continue to plow all my time and energy into this relationship, or if there's an opportunity cost with that, right? You know, you're putting so much of your time and energy into that thing that you're then not putting that time and energy into something else. I think we've all been at a place where we've said, well, I could keep going down that rabbit hole, or I think that probably the best thing for both of us in the long term is to actually just part ways. And often we look back on that with the fullness of time, and we kind of feel like, hey, it was really hard at that time to part ways, but actually it's one of the best things that's happened to me in my life to end that personal relationship,
to flourish in other
relationships. Do other things. Yeah, we've all been there, right? So yeah, sometimes that's definitely the best thing to do.
Yeah, beautiful. So you work with a variety of organizations to deliver your courses. How can people find out more or enroll in one of your courses? What have you got?
Yeah, so the two areas that I work in are around leadership, which includes emotional intelligence, but is not limited to that, and around giving business presentations. And essentially what I'm all about is working with organizations where people are just tired of being in that kind of tick the box training mode, and they really want to enable their people to get better business outcomes, whether that be around leadership or around business presentations. And the best way for people to get in contact is just either via LinkedIn. So my surname is Jeremy Davis, Davis. I'm in Melbourne, or my email address, which is just jeremy@jeremymarkdavis.com.
Yeah, beautiful. And you're a really responsive and giving person. So don't be afraid to reach out to Jeremy if you've got questions or you want to find out more about his courses. Thank you so much, Jeremy. That was really insightful. I really enjoyed that.
No, it was fun. It was good to reconnect with you again, Lindsay. And yeah, I wish you and all your viewers a happy and prosperous 2024.
Thank you so much. If you found this episode valuable, please leave our podcast a review to subscribe to future episodes. Next time we are talking to Phil Hayes Sinclair, and he's a serial entrepreneur who has honed in on the importance of partnerships. And with 25 years experience in building business, he will have some wonderful insights that everyone can learn from. So be sure to listen to that one. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful week.